Right, everybody, welcome back. It's the end of the world with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu. Today we are continuing our series on the lost continent, lost paradise of Atlantis. The not real place that nonetheless maintains an overlarge presence in the imagination of Western literature. And today we're going to try and get into why that is. Like, why is it that 2,000 plus years after Plato wrote his little myth of Atlantis, are so many people in America who are alive right now certain that Atlantis was not only real, but that with the proper, search techniques, we can locate it and harness the allegedly magnificent technologies to be found in this undersea wonderland.
Wait, so is this primarily an American phenomenon? Are there people all over the world?
Yeah, there are people all over the world. I mean, in Europe primarily. I don't think there's too many people in Japan and China who are particularly concerned about Atlantis. It is a sort of Atlantic-leaning obsession.
But it started, the new myth, shall we say, started in America?
Yeah, I mean, let's go through so last time, I have a couple of things I want to correct from last time. Well, not correct, but sort of respond to. Well, one question you had that I didn't have a good answer is, like, if Atlantis isn't real, why did Plato spend all this time, situating it within with its Solon, with these historical individuals who allegedly...
Right, the letter that was found, the Egyptian record, the mysterious record.
Right, well, on Wikipedia, I found an answer to this. Plato scholar Julia Annas, who's a professor at Arizona, says, the continuing industry of discovering Atlantis illustrates the dangers of reading Plato, for he is really using what has become a standard device of fiction, stressing the historicity of an event and the discovery of hitherto unknown authorities as an indication that what follows is fiction. The idea is that we should use the story to examine our ideas of government and power. We've missed the point if instead of thinking about these issues, we go off exploring the seabed. This continued misunderstanding of Plato as historian here enables us to see why his distrust of imaginative writing is sometimes justified, which I think is really good because, one of the famous things about Plato is in the Republic, he outlaws poetry. He's like, look, no, we can't have any poets in the Republic. They're all liars, right? We need, how in the modern state, one of the things we commonly think about is how the state has monopoly on violence. For Plato, that was also true. But in the Republic, the state would also have a monopoly on lying. Only the government would be allowed to lie, and they would create what he calls a noble lie that would be a myth. They would tell everyone about their origins that would justify the social stratification and why certain people were in certain jobs and things like this.
Now that never took root, huh?
There's no history of anything resembling this in the real world. Thank goodness. But so I think that it kind of answers the question is that Plato builds up this idea that it's historical because it's a sort of rhetorical technique to signal to those in the know that what follows is in fact completely ahistorical. But moving on from that.
Mission accomplished.
Yeah. Yeah. No one misinterpreted that at all later. So I said last time that no one in the ancient world believed in Atlantis. That's not entirely true. There's some people in later antiquity, talking about the 5th century CE, so about 700 or 800 years after Plato lived. One of his disciples, the Neoplatonist Proclus, claimed that no, Atlantis was true, and he talks about this treatise that he has access to that we have lost, which may have really existed. It's possible for us to verify. That was by a student of Plato who claimed to have gone to Egypt and seen the documents that Solon.
So the same documents.
Yeah, the mysterious documents. But again, this is someone 800 years later saying that he has a text that's conveniently lost now.
Right.
So.
But he went back, and no one had found it in the meantime.
But this is a student of Plato, like within Plato's lifetime, allegedly had gone to Atlantis. This is what Proclus says, even though Proclus himself is living well after all of this.
Okay, so he's retelling it, saying actually someone did find it.
He's claiming that there's corroborative evidence from this other student of Plato's, but he also worshipped Plato. Plato was like the great master of his school of thinking, so maybe he was uncomfortable with the idea that Plato may have just made up this legend of Atlantis. Some early Christian writers also are into Atlantis, but they claim the reason Atlantis was destroyed is because Atlantis was too pagan. Atlantis had not received the wisdom of Christ. Never mind that, again, this is 9,000 years before Jesus, etc., etc. In the Renaissance, there's a little bit of an uptick in interest in Atlantis, but again, entirely on the idealized, fictional, philosophical side. So
so they're not believing it.
No, but they're using the idea as a kind of model for their own vision.
But the idea is that they actually did interpret it correctly, right?
That's right. Yeah. So famous work by St. Thomas More, the Utopia, which is a sort of idealized Christian vision of a city. But it's important to remember that utopia, utopos in Greek, means one interpretation of it is ideal place, but another reading is just no place. Like, it's not a real place. So utopos means literally like a place that is not real.
Imaginary.
Yeah, imaginary place, basically. Sure. And then Francis Bacon came a little bit later, about a century after More, and wrote a book called The New Atlantis, which is, again, about a fictional ideal society, but in Bacon's case, that society is situated in the New World, right? So, and this kind of
where's Utopia situated?
I don't really remember. Like, it's nowhere. It's it's imaginary.
Right. So, but neither of them are actually making reference to a physical Atlantis buried under the sea.
No one believes that Atlantis. At least they don't believe. But the Bacon thing will come back in a little bit. But where does the modern craze from Atlantis come
how did this happen?
We can lay that at the feet of an American. Thank God. Finally.
Classic.
USA back on top. And in this case, it is the Atlantis, or the Antediluvian World, by Ignatius Donnelly, which was published in 1882, and which I looked through. I will not say that I read it exhaustively, because it is about the most boring, ridiculous book in the world. But Donnelly's kind of an interesting character nonetheless. This is the book that was a huge hit and sparked interest in Atlantis as a historical place that might be located.
And when you're saying a huge hit, are you talking about popular?
Yeah, it sold thousands and thousands of copies during Donnelly's lifetime. Yeah, Donnelly was a successful author for a couple books. He wrote another book called something like Ragnarok that was about how all of the world's deluge myths are the same. That they're really, in other words, that the great flood of Noah was historical, and
this is about the world before the flood.
Yeah, exactly. Which is what antediluvian means, exactly. And he then his career kind of ran aground, however, when he wrote a book that was basically like Francis Bacon was Shakespeare, and I think
when you say that, like, he's paying him a compliment, or he's saying
no. He's saying, the real Shakespeare. There's this whole Shakespeare authorship conspiracy theory.
Yes, of course.
Which is very popular in the sort of dime square set, oddly, in contemporary culture.
Oh, really?
Curtis Yarvin, the Urbit founder,
interesting,
sort of right-wing provocateur, crypto millionaire, is a big. Oxford, the Earl of Oxford, was secretly Shakespeare. Never mind.
I thought it was the Earl of Rochester.
No, that Earl of Rochester's Rochester's Jane Eyre. Like that's another literary character. But it's the Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere, who died in, I think, 1605. And even though
wasn't there also a school of thought that there were a bunch of different people?
I mean, Shakespeare authorship stuff is there's so much of it, and it's all garbage, if you ask me. Like, most of it's just class based. They're like, Shakespeare didn't go to Cambridge or Oxford, so how could he have written the best poems and plays in the English language? It's like, okay, I see where you're coming from. Not interested. In any case, no, his book about Shakespeare, I think he also claimed that Bacon was like the secret child of Queen Elizabeth. And there's all sorts of just what are we doing?
And this came after.
Yeah, and he went to England in the 1880s, and he went to Oxford and Cambridge and like argued
to get to the bottom of it.
Well, no, to argue in their famous sort of debate colloquia that resolved Francis Bacon, and he was just pilloried, like ridiculed by the dons and the students at Oxford. Literally run out of town. The book was a huge flop, and his literary career essentially ends at that point. He writes a few more books, but they're more fictional. He was also a congressman. He was in the post-Civil War era. He was a Republican. He was anti-slavery, ally of the party of Lincoln, and he was also in the Minnesota State Senate. And it's only in his 50s. He's born in 1831, and in his 50s he turns to these pseudo-archaeological points of view. Now, despite his being anti-slavery, he definitely was still a huge racist. Like he believes in a sort of racial hierarchy where whites are on top and everyone else is underneath.
Right. You shouldn't be slaves, but careful. That type of thing.
Yeah. Which is not unusual
not uncommon for the time, yeah.
But still pretty repugnant. And so what does he say? How does he make his case for Atlantis? Well, he says, what if actually, you know that story Plato tells in the Critias about Atlantis? What if that wasn't a myth at all, but was in fact true? And
so he just goes with it, or what?
Yeah, he's like, yeah, it's true. And he goes through. His main evidence is the superficial similarities between cultures on either side of the Atlantic, right? So it's the classic stuff like, hey, these Mayan people, aren't they interesting? Oh, what's that in the jungle there? Oh my God, it's a pyramid. Where have I seen them? In Egypt? Wait a minute. Two different people had the same idea? There must be an antecedent people that seeded both of them with the idea of the pyramid. As if the pyramid is not literally the most obvious like design. Oh, what if we just piled up stones like big at the bottom and they got thinner towards the top? Yeah. Right? No, there had to be some ancient race of geniuses that inspired this. He's also really fixated on Peru. Like Machu Picchu hadn't been uncovered further west at this point, but there were impressive Incan ruins that were well known at the time, and he basically says like there's no way that two such magnificent civilizations as Peru and Egypt could have come to be without there being some intervening. And he just literally the book is 600 pages long, Michael. And he just goes through the most specious arguments I've ever encountered. Like it's like so thin and so weak. And like just to like refute this a little bit, Inca civilization arose in 1438. It was preceded by the Kingdom of Cusco, which had some similarities but much smaller. That started in 11 to 1200. So, okay. That's, 700 years before the time of Donnelly. It was destroyed by 1533 by the Spanish, in the famous conquistador incident.
Incident.
The incident. I mean, they betrayed the emperor of the Incas so brutally. It's a really dark story. We'll talk about that another time. I think.
Yeah, sure.
It's probably a good topic to bring up in terms of an actual civilization being destroyed as opposed to a fictional one. But he basically says, oh yeah, so 1400s, right? When was Egypt? We talked about Egypt last time. When did I say Egypt got started?
Like 5,000 years before.
Right, like 4,000 BC to 3,000 BC. Right. So we're talking about. So it's like, all right. So there's this great civilization of Atlantis, and they broke up, but some people survived, and they went to different parts of the world. And Why did they wait for 4,000 years to get started in Peru, right?
It's not for Donnelly to say, maybe, Stu. All he's reporting are the facts as he sees them, right?
One thing that's really funny also is he's like, we should believe in Plato. Look, in Plato's narrative, this is a quote from Donnelly, there are in Plato's narrative no marvels, no myths, no tales of gods, gorgons, hobgoblins, or giants.
Yes, a distinct lack of hobgoblins really opened my eyes.
Which, first of all, that's not true, right? I mean, we talked last time, like, the son of Poseidon starts Atlantis, or the beloved Atlas, right? And second of all, this is like the weakest form of argumentation imaginable. So if I tell you anything and I don't mention the supernatural, you perforce must agree with and believe in me, right? I'm like, yeah, well,
everyone is of typical human size. This story must be accurate.
I mean,
not a giant or a hobbit to be seen as far as the eye, like,
let's put this in the true column. Check.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is like the level of rationality and argumentation Donnelly is working with. And he just goes on and on and on. It is so tedious. I cannot recommend not reading it more. Yeah. Anyway, he also claims that all mythological paradises, be they the Garden of Eden or, the Elysian fields of Greek myth, whatever it is, are based on an universal memory of a great land where early mankind dwelt in peace and harmony. And that land was...
like a subconscious memory?
Well, sort of oral history, something that's passed on over the generations.
So,
right?
So there's no evidence of it. It's just the idea that everyone has a feeling of an Atlantis.
Yeah. That there's there's an Atlantis inside all of us, Michael.
I mean, that would be great, but
Well, we'll come back to that idea in a bit. But he basically says that the destruction of Atlantis is similarly the source of all the flood myths, right? There are flood myths in many ancient cultures, in Sumerian, in obviously Jewish, in the Bible, right? And of course, in Greek myth, there's a flood of Deucalion and Pyrrha who repopulate the earth, right? This is a very common trope. There are even flood myths to be found in New World cultures. For this reason, Donnelly is like, well, this is, again, it's the memory of the death of Atlantis, right? And as I said at the beginning, that's what he picks up on in his sequel. His also massively successful follow-up called Ragnarok. He also claims that, these myths have been passed down by the lucky few who survived Atlantis. And he also, with no evidence...
Oh, there were survivors.
Oh, yeah. There are a couple of people got away. They're the ones who seeded cultures on the other side of both sides.
And just sort of like didn't drive too hard to the hoop of where they came from. They just kind of like gave some information about how to build a pyramid out to people and thought they'd figure it out eventually.
I mean, it doesn't make any sense, right?
Because Donnelly's not saying like there's some trove of documentation or
no, but we'll get to that. That will
building manuals.
Well, that will come back later, though. There are people who do believe that such documents exist,
but not Donnelly.
No, Donnelly, like, for all of his...
Donnelly's argument is just that, like, people were feeling this Atlantis thing?
No, that we have all these similarities, these myths, these buildings, these structures that exist on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Therefore, there must have been some earlier civilization, i.e.
in the middle,
Atlantis, that was in contact with both sides and seeded these techniques and myths, never mind the wildly different time frame.
But does he have? Is there anything like, how we've got this story about Solon, right? So that comes from Plato. That comes from the European side.
Yep.
Does he have any reference to an Atlantis?
Well, that's a little tougher because, as you may know, the Spanish. First of all, the Incas did not have writing, right? The Incas did not write. The Mayans wrote. And the Aztecs, I think, wrote as well, but
the people from Atlantis didn't share that.
Not with the Incas, apparently, but
just how to build the pyramids.
Yeah, how that was transmitted over the 2,000 years, 3,000 years, unclear. But the Spanish also burned like 99.9% of all indigenous writing in the Americas.
Okay.
So if such a text had existed, it was destroyed during the conquest by the conquistadors. But he does say he does say the Atlanteans invented the alphabet, the very alphabet that we use, the Phoenician, which became the Roman alphabet. Yeah. And that Mayan alphabet is also just a form, a sort of mutated form of our alphabet, which is not true at all. Scholars are still working on deciphering the Mayan alphabet. There have been a lot of, there's a lot of progress made in that area. Also doesn't explain why the ancient Egyptians didn't write in the alphabet. They just hieroglyphs, right? Which is actually closer to an alphabetical form of writing than people realize, but it looks nothing like the later, Anyway, none of this stuff makes sense. It's all incredibly weak. And this goes against, everything that we know about, like linguistics, the origins of language, the origins of writing. But Donnelly didn't know that. He's writing in the 1880s, we give him a break. He also claims, like, the Azores, it's a big... the Azores are the last little nub of Atlantis that's above the earth. Above the waves, rather.
I lived there for a year.
Well, we've talked about it many times. That's one of the
Didn't realize I was on quite such an important piece of property.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the many things I've learned from doing this podcast with you is your Azores adventure.
Let's call it my Atlantis adventure.
The reason he thinks the Azores were part of Atlantis, however, is that Plato, in his myth of Atlantis, mentions that the Atlanteans had colored stones. They were red and black and white. And those stones, Michael, red, black, and white stones, they can be found where? That's right.
The Azores.
The Azores.
Yeah.
So therefore, 1 + 1 = 2. Mission accomplished. Let's raise the banner. We got it. So this is just really like almost free associative level of reasoning. Like, oh, that thing is red, therefore they're the same thing.
Is he in Congress when he puts this book
No, he's out of Congress.
Is...
His political career is over. This is why he has the time to devote himself to his studies.
A man can get some real thinking done once he's out of Congress in the post-Civil War era.
Yeah, exactly. It's, as I said, it's a 500-page book. It's incredibly boring, and the logic that animates the entire enterprise is so ludicrous as to be immediately dismissible. Nonetheless, has this ever stopped anything from becoming enormously popular in the past? No. Does the same kind of thing animate people in America today? Yes.
Right.
I mean, all you have to do...
It became popular...
Immediately. And internationally. Like, it was popular in Europe. It was popular everywhere.
And so who was gravitating to this book?
Well, I think we have to situate this in the time, right? This is the post-Civil War era. This is an era when mysticism is really on the rise. And I think one of the reasons in America that's pointed to is something called spirit photography. You ever seen these photos? They're like a photo of a couple, and there'll be like a ghostly image of another person in the back. Yeah. And the claim was, oh, that's your dead son. The son who died in the Civil War. He's back, and people will be like, oh, thank God, thank you.
Right, he's with you. Yeah,
right, and of course it's just a double exposure, right? They have an image of the son. It's a trick, but people want to believe it. Right. Yeah. In the aftermath of the Civil War, in which 600,000 plus Americans died, there were a lot of people grieving and longing for a connection with the afterlife. Right? Mary Todd Lincoln, the president's wife, was into seances and communicating with the dead. This was like a not uncommon phenomenon, or a hobby even, at the time. And this would continue. And it would continue until the First World War, right? In the aftermath of the First World War, you have all these spiritualists who emerge, the foremost of whom was, in fact, Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, which is wonderful, right?
What?
Yeah, Sherlock Holmes, the most rational, hyper,
exactly.
the guy who created that spent the last 30 plus years of his life trying to contact the dead, like just constantly going to every every seance, doing every kind of reading.
And to some degree, this still remains. I mean, you hear all the time of people who they lose a loved one. I mean, it's understandable.
Well, that's what happened with Doyle.
Right?
His son died suddenly.
Right. And so like, they look for different avenues.
Absolutely. Right. And I think after the First World War, another event of mass slaughter, there are people who are suddenly open to these New Age, well, what will become the New Age views, right? So one of the people that really kind of lays the groundwork for this, and one last thing on Donnelly, right, is that his belief in Atlantis is basically because of racism, right? Like the theory the theory that every civilization must have been inspired by, this is called hyperdiffusionism. Right. So hyperdiffusionism means that all ideas and all cultures have disseminated from this one source, in this case, Atlantis, right? And the Atlanteans are, that's right, white people, right? Yeah. So the people that taught, these Mayans. What
are the chances?
Yeah. So these Mayans who built these pyramids, these pyramids are pretty cool. This is pretty sophisticated. Oh, this writing is very beautiful. This art. I know there was a white teacher race that taught them how to do it. Even with Egypt, right? It's like, these brown-skinned Egyptians have made this like pretty impressive civilization. I wonder how.
Okay.
Oh, I know. They were an outpost of Atlantis. Aha.
Right, which sort of goes back into the maintenance of this completely absurd hierarchy of races. Right?
Exactly. And I mean, I think you can find this even in Ancient Aliens, right? Why are Ancient Aliens never accused of having built like Notre Dame Cathedral, right?
Sure.
No one's ever like, aliens came and like instructed the French how to construct this this monumental medieval, right? It's always, this Vietnamese palace. How could look, an alien has left his mark here, right? It's
never Von Däniken with the pyramids, right?
Yeah, I mean, exactly.
Same
we'll get into Von Däniken and Graham Hancock and that whole industry a little bit at the end of the episode. But yeah, the teacher race. And to Donnelly's credit, though, I mean, obviously, again, I don't think he was overtly racist in the way that some later people definitely are. I think he is operating in the paradigms of his time. It's wrong. It is racist. And he also does not attribute to Atlantis any miraculous power or technology in the way
outside of their whiteness.
Right. Well, I mean, they were good at building stuff, but it's not like they could fly or had lasers.
I see what you're saying.
There's nothing magical about them. They're just a sophisticated.
And he's not imagining like an advanced civilization beyond its time.
No, that will come with Madame Helena Blavatsky, who is
what's
a world famous crank. We don't have time to get into her too much, but basically she's a scam artist and charlatan who is the founder of Theosophism, Theosophy as it's called. And she immediately heard about this Atlantis stuff and was like, yes. She just glommed onto it immediately. She wrote a book, I think in 1888, called The Secret Doctrine. And this is a book that contains a secret doctrine that was dictated where? In Atlantis. And
wait a minute. So she didn't write it.
She wrote it, but she claimed
she claimed she didn't write it.
Well, she claimed it was dictated to her by an ascended master who visited her in a vision. You know, it's just.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But yes,
so she's crossing over and shit like that.
Oh, 100%. She's claiming that these long dead spirits are visiting her and filling her mind with this Atlantean knowledge and stuff like this.
Got it.
She's also, wait for it, huge racist. She believed that men did not evolve from primates. What a shock. And instead, each race was created separately and sprung up in different parts of the world. With one, the Aryan race, as she called them, descending from the Atlanteans. And yes, this is where the Nazi obsession with the Aryans comes from. From Madame Blavatsky, among other places. But yeah, she died long before any of these people were adults.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, like Himmler especially was obsessed with this idea of the Aryan race as devised by Madame Blavatsky as the Aryans who were from Atlantis were the most superior of all the races, yada, yada, yada. And this is where the idea of them having some superior knowledge, some secret wisdom. Like neither Plato nor Donnelly really valorize Atlantis that much, but Blavatsky's like, no, Plato doesn't actually. Plato got it all wrong. They were the most powerful. They were the best. They had the best technology. They were the origin of my ascendant masters, right? She also pushes the dates back a little bit. She's like, Plato said 9,000 years ago. No. Try 900,000 years ago. Yeah. So
just to give more space to this? What's that for? Who cares?
I have no idea what she's thinking. She's just like, what if they were even more ancient and powerful than we could possibly imagine? And she claims that, like,
oh, right. I guess they're even more powerful if they have this advanced technology even longer, even further.
Yeah, before modern humans are like fully developed as we now know,
yeah,
right? It's like around, possibly modern humans were coming into being around then. But, there are probably like, I don't know, 1,000 of them maybe. Right. Sure. I mean, it's pretty early in the game.
But really good at what they did.
Right. Yeah. Mostly you've got like Homo erectus and Homo habilis like wandering around, sort of first Homo sapiens are kind of like, oh, who are those guys, right?
Meanwhile, the Atlanteans are building like pyramids all over the place.
And you know what? And who's helping the Atlanteans do this? It's aliens, probably. Right? It's some kind of extra. This is where aliens.
So she threw this in.
Well, it's hinted at. It's suggested. Okay. It'll become much bigger later. Fear not. So Blavatsky is a crank, a fascinating crank, but a crank nonetheless. And theosophy became very popular. A lot of people believe this. It's a sort of, again, it has the appeal of a conspiracy theory, which is that it's letting you in on secret hidden knowledge, right? And the name for that Blavatsky devised was the Akashic Records, which is this alleged Atlantean text that is a kind of compendium of all human and possibly superhuman knowledge.
And it's buried too, but
we'll get to that. Well, it was some of it was transmitted to her through psychic energies. But
wow, that's lucky.
Yeah, and this brings us to one of my favorite characters, namely Edgar Cayce. The sleeping prophet, right?
Sleeping prophet.
Yeah, Edgar Cayce.
He didn't even have to be awake to get his shit.
Well, that's right.
I love this guy.
Edgar Cayce lived from 1877 to 1945, residing ultimately in Virginia Beach. But he moved around a lot. He's, I think, originally born in Kentucky, moved up to various cities, would often get run out of town for basically practicing medicine without a license. Because one of his big things was he was a sleeping prophet, which is to say, he would go to sleep, and while he was asleep, people would ask him questions, and he would answer. And his answers were understood to have certain psychic, prophetic powers, right?
So he'd pretend to be asleep.
I mean, no video exists. I don't know. I would love for there to be like a video of what this actually looked like. Imagine if you go on TikTok and be like, oh, what's the sleeping prophet got to say today? Oh, interesting. Right, yeah. But at various points in his career, and he's flourished kind of in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and then died pretty suddenly.
God, this is recent.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's quite recent.
My God.
And stockbrokers would be like, wait a minute. Maybe I'm onto a little edge here. So they would be his patrons. They'd be like, Edgar.
Oh, you're serious?
I'm 100% serious. They'd be like, Edgar, what's going to happen with the price of apples? Yeah. Edgar, are you feeling anything about oil futures? Right? And I think Cayce, he wasn't rich. I think by the end of his life, after all this, he was quite comfortable. But he was from a log. He was a sort of Abraham Lincoln type. He was born in a log cabin. Barely went to school.
Right, but at some point, it pays to see the future in your sleep.
Well, provided like anything you ever say is true. I mean, he was one of these guys who was like, the world will end in 1936. There'll be San Francisco and Los Angeles will be destroyed in a massive earthquake in 1936, which, as we know, happened. And there's never. No, wait, that did not happen. Yeah, so like all, but the thing about prophecy is, right, and we'll do an episode in the future on the Millerites and certain other prophetic groups, is, well, there's a doomsday prophet and everyone's ready for doomsday, and then doomsday comes and nothing happens. You'd think, oh, well, I'm going to just reject this. I've been led astray. This prophet is a charlatan. No. People double down. People are like, there must have been a something.
Right,
something.
Math is off.
The signals were crossed, right? And the prophet usually would be like,
the good news, I now know.
Yeah, God is. Wait, hold on. I'm getting a text. It's God. He says, "Apocalypse next year." I mean, and like this will happen over and over again, and people will stick with it. So even though Edgar Cayce was constantly wrong about stuff, and I have in fact never seen a incident of him being right about anything. I mean, allegedly he could cure, like he had a back injury and he fell asleep and was like, you must give me 3 tablespoons of turpentine or whatever, whatever his remedy was. His parents followed his instructions and he was miraculously healed.
And then he was like, and now he's just lying about his back for the rest of his life.
Well, no, but also weird things would happen with Cayce where he would go for a year without speaking. He'd be like, really? I've lost my voice. But he could sort of speak in a little whisper.
Oh, so it's all to build this air of mystery.
I mean, how much of this is deliberate and how much of it is just him being a genuinely, quite eccentric, strange man? I don't know. But at some point, Cayce started having visions of, that's right, Atlantis. He would say, I was in Atlantis. I'm in Atlantis. I'm seeing the wonderful things, the floating cities, the golden palace, And right. he would claim that he could have access, just like Madame Blavatsky before him. And he was directly influenced by Blavatsky. This is not a coincidence. He would say, the Akashic records, I am reading them. I am learning the secret history of the world. And people love this stuff. There were always people who would come along and pay to get a reading from Cayce. They would pay to read his books. There was books written about him. There's a biography written about him in his lifetime, right? Someone came up to him and was like, oh, Mr. Cayce, I'm so moved by your story. Let me tell it to the masses, right? And it's this kind of idealizing picture of Cayce as an American original. He's an interesting figure. Was he just a crank charlatan? Probably, right? But, maybe he was onto something. Maybe he was right. Well, his big claim, though, about Atlantis is that actually records from Atlantis do survive. Good news. And you know what? I know where they are. All you have to do is dig under the Sphinx in Egypt.
In Egypt?
The Sphinx? Yeah, Egypt in his vision was
so the Solon thing might be right after all.
Well, it is right. I mean, obviously, good for the sleeping prophet's not going to lie to you, Michael. And to this day, there are people insisting that we must excavate underneath the Sphinx to access this secret.
Really?
Oh, yeah. It's in pseudo-archaeological circles, it is huge, right? So Cayce is kind of the jumping off point to where we get to the kind of more modern Atlantean believers. And these are we get to just sort of general crank theorists at this point. People who believe, like Eric von Daniken, right? Who I think in the late 60s, early 70s, Chariots of the Gods. He's the one who's saying, Atlantis isn't so central, but he's clearly inspired by Cayce and these other hyperdiffusionists. Where he's saying, actually, it's aliens, right? And he explains the sort of time gaps between the New World and Egypt. Well, aliens came at different times. Some aliens came to Egypt 5,000 years ago, and then some dropped into Peru in the 900s. And so some came to the Mayas, right. So
they just love teaching about pyramids.
Yeah, they're very into it.
They're very into it. And despite all that time passing, they still love it.
Yeah. And despite them being aliens who can fly to the Earth, they're like, Earthmen, we're back, and good news.
You call this place Peru?
Did you know? Did you know that you could build this thing called a pyramid? Let us show you, right? And in fact, let us use our alien technology, right? And today,
but while doing that, never explaining that another alien actually did this in Egypt.
No. And also never being like, by the way, there's this thing called the internal combustion engine. Oh, here's this material you might find useful. It's called iron. right? This thing's steam. You can harness it with the iron to make an engine, right? Like none of this.
They were like, we'll help you build these perfect structures, but we don't want you to get too ahead of yourself. Yeah, after all, there's a hierarchy of races that even you don't know about.
Right. And we the aliens and like what do these aliens look like? Are they squid aliens? Are they gray aliens? Right. Unclear. But to this day we've got Graham Hancock, who has a new series that's dropping this very week about like ancient apocalypse in the Americas, right?
Yeah. And we'll have to do a more exhaustive look at Hancock.
We will. I mean, a lot of people have debunked him. There's that guy on YouTube.
I mean, we don't need to debunk him.
Okay.
It would be fun just to talk about this.
Yeah. I mean, another thing that comes out of the Donnelly Atlantis stuff is this thing called Mayanism, which is the belief that the Maya are possessed of this secret knowledge that's maybe just left over from a little place called Atlantis.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a deeper spiritual, and this is a thing that starts even a little before Donnelly, but Donnelly's book kind of propels it forward and becomes very big in the 70s, and then has a big spike of interest again in 2012. I think we did.
Oh, interesting.
We may have done a little episode about that. Yeah. So the Mayan apocalypse theory also has roots in the Atlantean thing. One of the reasons the Maya were considered to be these prophets of doom were because they were drawing on this Atlantean tradition.
Right.
Now, just to wrap up, like a couple of modern Atlantis sites. Because
when you say modern, do you mean like now?
Well, places that are still extant today that modern people believe to be remnants of Atlantis.
Okay.
One of them is the Bimini Road. The Bimini is an isle in the Bahamas. And the Bimini Road is a bunch of stone structures that are a little bit off the coast that look like, wait for it, a road. But they're deeply underwater. Are they a road? Probably not. Is it a natural formation of rock? Most likely. Does that mean that the Graham Hancocks and the Eric von Danikens of the world think that? Absolutely not. No. This is leftover.
Actually, it was a 72-lane highway.
This was where, exactly. Like, this is actually part of the Atlantis Metro network.
Right.
There's a 72-lane highway. Yeah, Bimini Road's cool, though. It's a place people go scuba diving. There's, like, this weird, kind of even rock formation. People have been claiming that it was Atlantis at least since the 60s. And is it Atlantis? Probably not. One of the big undoers of Atlantis is, of course, the discovery of plate tectonics, right? Plate tectonics was confirmed, basically, in the 20th century, before Donnelly. So after that, the idea that there had been recently, within the last 10,000 years, a massive continent that just sunk, that didn't happen. Right? That's not how it works, right? So since then, a lot of people have been like, no, it wasn't a continent. It was just it was an island. It was a city-state. It was the people, they moved away from that. Another place is in modern Spain, a lost city of Tartessos. Tartessos seems to have been a highly advanced civilization in the time of the ancient Greeks. By the time of the Romans, it was completely gone. No one knows what happened to it, but there are relics you can see if you ever go to Barcelona, especially. There are relics, beautiful statues that are assumed to have come from this lost civilization of Tartessos. Was Tartessos Atlantis? No, it's probably just another city that got destroyed or defeated for some reason or another.
Right.
But people have tried to be like, no, Tartessos was actually Atlantis. Because it's in Spain. It's on the other side of the Pillars of Hercules, fits some of the Platonic categories. Last place, Yonaguni Monument, which is in the Pacific, not Atlantic. And yet, it's a hidden thing off the coast of Japan. It's very cool, kind of similar to the Bimini Road, but even bigger. And again, it's a just massive rock structure that kind of looks like a pyramid, maybe, except it's like it has these like angular cuts in it that make it seem like it was made by humans. Was it? Probably not. Again, probably just a real interesting.
But it wasn't a road-looking thing.
No, it's more of like a structure. It's more of like it looks like a monument of some kind that was maybe cut out of a massive rock that was at one point above water, but is now deep underwater. It's very cool looking. There's debate about whether it's man-made or not. Mostly people think it's not, but again, the Hancocks of the world. And also, what does this have to do with Atlantis? It's in the Pacific. Well, nothing. But again, like this desire to have this lost like place, I think, is kind of at the center, right? And I think like that's really what Atlantis is all about. It's about romanticism, It's about, hey, human beings, we were once on top of the world. We were in Atlantis. We ruled the seven seas. We had outposts in America. We had outposts in Africa. We had outposts in Europe. We were the kings of the world. And then, you know what? We lost it. We sunk under the weight of our own hubris. We flew too
ingenious.
We flew too close to the sun.
Right.
But those days, you know what? We're still striving all these years later to get back. And maybe through some luck, we'll find that trove of documents and we'll live in paradise once again.
Well, not luck. We just have to dig underneath the Sphinx.
we just need to.
It's more an issue of political will than anything else.
Yeah, we just need to destroy one of the most important ancient monuments in the world, which we're gradually destroying anyway with the pollution and other, But yeah, I think that's what Atlantis is all about. It's just like the Garden of Eden, We've got to get back to the garden, right? We've got to like find a way back into paradise. We've got to get ourselves back to the garden. I was thinking of the CSNY version of the Joni Mitchell Woodstock, right? And like, I think that's normal. I think it's normal to feel like the human race has fallen, and it's Christianity, right? Like it's pretty basic. Anyway, do you have any other big takeaways from Atlantis, Michael?
No, I mean, I think it's ultimately like kind of tragically obvious that this would catch on. And, I mean, it makes too much sense for it to not have happened in a way. I mean, obviously, like Donnelly, I guess, was just like a product of his time, sort of caught fire, right? Yeah,
I mean, it's like QAnon or any other number of utterly ludicrous conspiracies that have caught on.
Right.
The JFK
like
conspiracy.
The overarching like desperation to explain things that either are difficult to explain or have already been explained in some non-sensational way, that there always has to be some sort of like deeper meaning and truth to basically everything, right?
And that it would take root in America, a place where everyone believes they're a temporarily dispossessed millionaire, right? Like,
yeah, right.
Oh yeah. I may be working in the dirt farm at the moment, but my ancestors, they were in Atlantis.
But if you dare tax capital gains, I will come for you.
Yeah. Well, that was fun. I think that about wraps up what I've got on Atlantis. And next week we will be pivoting back to politics. And,
yes, to the modern Atlantis.
The potential administration of Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. And if you like the show, please like and subscribe. Please follow us on Instagram. Please follow us on the podcatcher of your choice. We are available on all of the podcatchers. We are on YouTube as well. The End of the World WMS on Instagram. And we'll be talking about politics. I think the next few episodes are gonna be about the election, just because that's what's coming up.
We're gonna start by just taking a look at some of the issues of the election as they pertain to some of the apocalyptic themes that make up this podcast. So climate change, nuclear war, future of weaponry, military, AI, surveillance, all that type of stuff.
Optimistic stuff, uplifting stuff.
Right, and I'm sure we'll find a lot of really, really coherent thoughts on the various policy pages of the candidates. So.
Oh, and a lot to be lot to be optimistic about.
Very hopeful for. I hear that we're in the process of creating the next most lethal military in the history of the world. So, keep on dreaming.
The lethality speech. How quickly we forget. So that'll be interesting. I'm looking forward to it. But until then, this has been The End of the World with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu, and we'll talk to you real soon.